Hey, what's up? John Sonmez from SimpleProgrammer.com. So I'm over here for Thanksgiving at my in-laws' house, up in the Bay Area, Northern California. Someday when I come up here, sometime I'll have to do a meetup for those of you that are in the area. But I thought I'd do a couple of videos while going for a walk here. So I got this question, a comment on one of my YouTube videos, one of my book review videos. If you haven't seen, I do a lot of book reviews. You can check them out here. I basically read a couple of books a week in general, usually. And when I say read, I listen to audio versions. I also read books as well, but I really don't see much of a difference. Some people are rude and point out that they think there is a difference, but really, it doesn't really matter if it's you reading it or someone reading it to you. And I guess I'd say about that also, what are you going to do? What are you going to spend your time doing? You're going to spend your time, when you're running or commuting in the car, doing nothing, or are you going to listen to books? It's better to listen to books, right? Better to gain that education. So, anyway, with that said, there was a video. I keep on saying anyway. I'm trying to break that habit. There's a comment on one of the videos that basically said, hey, so, with all the books that you read every week, how do you apply them to your life, right? All this new material, all this new stuff, how do you go about actually applying this to your life? Wouldn't it be better to focus on reading maybe less books, but spending more time on those books and spending that time to apply it to your life? And I think this is a good question. This is something I've thought about quite a bit. And I've thought about how I read books and study books, and I think there's a few different ways to look at this and to approach this subject. I've definitely got a few thoughts, and I'm not 100% sure, and I may switch it up from time to time, to be honest, to try some other things out. But here's some of my thoughts on this. This is how I sort of look at the situation. So first of all, as far as applying it to my life. The thing is, my general philosophy is that I count on that this is automatically going to be applied in my life in some way if it's a good idea, right? So now some books are more practical than others, right? And I wouldn't take this approach with learning something like programming language or a technical skill. But a lot of the books that I read are nonfiction books that are mindset, self-improvement, those type of books, right? Or maybe business books and things like that. And what I'm looking to gain out of those books is I'm looking to expand my thoughts a little bit, to learn something, to not necessarily develop a skill, right? And instead to improve my mindset in some way, to increase that capability, to gain some wisdom, some insight, something that I can apply to my life like that. And then the other thing about it is that I'm also looking for reinforcement of ideas, right? A lot of books that I read now, I'm already familiar with some of this content, right? A lot of, if you look at self-improvement or personal growth, I think personal growth is probably the best term, but if you look at those books, a lot of these ideas are very much the same idea. It's nothing completely new, but when you go and you reinforce that stuff and you repeatedly reinforce it, it sticks. It sticks better. It becomes integrated in part of your life. I think one of the things Tony Robbins sort of said it I think he said this multiple times, but and this is kind of funny because it's a little counterintuitive to my example, but he was talking to Jim Rohn about a book called Think and Grow Rich, which you can check out here. It's a book I highly recommend. But and he said that he read Think and Grow Rich, and Jim Rohn said, well, how many times have you read it? And Tony said, well, I read it once. And Jim Rohn said, well, I've read it 15 times. And he was saying basically that you gotta you got to really absorb it. It really has to be taken in. And again, I can see how that's kind of contradictory to what I'm saying here. But what I mean by this is it's that reinforcement of these ideas, these same ideas, these same concepts, until you hear it enough times that it actually changes your worldview and changes your core beliefs and actually spurns you to change. It changes the way that you think, right? That takes a long time for that to happen. It takes multiple exposures. You're not just going to read one book. So I think what happens a lot of times is a lot of people sometimes get too caught up in one particular book, and they think that it's that one book's going to change their life if they study it and apply that stuff. And you can do that maybe to some degree, but I find it more effective to let it more sink in and just assume that that knowledge is going to be there. And then the other piece of this, I mean, I could go on that for further, but let me get to a few of the other points here. So the other piece of this is that I think it's more beneficial in general to absorb a lot of content, right? It's sort of that prolific theory. And again, I've talked about this multiple times. I've talked about this as far as creation, but I think it also goes in this case of reading books, right? So, you could read very few books in the year and spend a lot of time studying those books in depth. And I think that you might get some benefit from doing that. And like I said, I may switch this up, but that's one strategy. And that strategy, I think, is very reasonable, and I think it makes sense. But another strategy is to just absorb a whole lot of books, right? So rather than me getting through maybe 10 books a year, if I get through 50 or 60 books a year, I'm guaranteed to get something out of it. In fact, I would say that, you're going to get more out of just the sheer volume of reading 50 to 60 books a year than you will out of the in-depth study of maybe 10 books a year, just because of the sheer volume, the sheer amount of stuff. And it only takes like a few good ideas or one good idea to completely change your life, right? Especially in business. So I'm looking for kind of this wide exposure, and there's so many books out there, so many ideas, so much to read, that I don't want to limit myself. And the other piece of this, I'd say also, is that there's a lot of crappy books out there, right? So the thing is, like, if I'm going to spend time, like, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time reading books that I'm not sure if they're going to be great, right? And studying those books, and what if those ideas aren't exactly right? I don't take anyone's word for gospel. So, I just have a hard time thinking, to really like in-depth study a book unless it's, just a classic that's been proven. And there are some of those, right? I think you could go through a book like Maximum Achievement by Brian Tracy, right? You can check out that book. And I think you could go through all the exercises in that book and really study that book and get a whole lot out of that book, right? But there's a lot of other books that, that in-depth study is not quite as useful, right? And you wouldn't get as much out of it. And so I get a wide exposure by reading 50, 60 books more a year. I end up seeing a lot of books. And here's what I do to let you know as well. A lot of those books that are good, that are really good, right? Because I'm getting a good survey, good volume of books. If they're really good, I listen to them again. In fact, I might listen to it again a second time right away, or I might get the print version and read that book and do a little bit more in-depth studying, or I might put that into my cycle of books that I'm going to listen to or read over and over again. I do have some of those books. Books like How to Win Friends and Influence People are on that list. Books like War of Art, I've read that multiple times, right? There's a bunch of books that are in this sort of cycle that I'm going to reread and continually study, and I get more out of it by having some spacing in between them sometimes, rather than just doing one in-depth study. So again, I guess, I could talk about this a lot because I've thought about this a lot, but I don't want to bore you with every single little detail I've come up with why I do this. But in general, where I'm at right now, like to summarize, is really that I think it's more beneficial to hit a huge volume of books, to reread the ones that are really good or impactful and that I can gain something out of, and to just assume that I'm going to absorb knowledge just by being exposed to it so much and getting that repeated exposure that's eventually going to sink in and grow me and change my understanding. And so far that's worked, right? Since I've really started hitting these books, since I've really started really maximizing my Audible subscription, I feel like I've grown in a lot of ways. I've learned a lot. My worldview's changed a lot. My thinking has changed a lot. So it seems to be working. Now, at some point, I may switch it up. I've thought about it. I may take a few books and study them in depth, or I might come up with a better system of doing this. Now, something that's helped me a little bit is to do the reviews on the books on this channel, but I haven't taken good enough notes in order to do really detailed or good reviews. So I may change my process a little bit. The problem is when you're running and you're listening to audiobooks, it's hard to take notes. So maybe I don't know, I got to figure out a good way for doing that. But with written books or Kindle books, certainly, yeah, I could do that. But I'm always improving and perfecting the process, and always growing and changing and seeing what works, right? So this is a phase that I'm doing now. Maybe I'll continue on this. Maybe I'll change it up, and maybe I'll switch back and forth. And there's not one right way to do things, but what I'm doing is working for me. What you might find more beneficial might be to do that in-depth study of lesser books, right? Or maybe to be very selective in filtering out the books. Maybe you go through my YouTube videos and you see my reviews, and that helps you determine what books you actually want to devote the time to reading, and that, and for you, that's how you do it. So anyway, my arm's getting really tired. I keep on having to hold it up. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to check out all my book reviews. And if you've got a comment or an idea on what you think about this topic, definitely leave it below. I'll talk to you next time. Take care.